sterile billionaire cries when he finds out that the poor black woman who saved him gave him twins. Alexander Pierce, a man defined by the legacy of his family's wealth and the reputation they've built over generations, finds himself sitting in the corner office of his high-rise building in Manhattan. The city buzzes below, a reminder of the empire his forefathers constructed brick by brick. Alexander is a meticulous-driven man, every action a calculated step towards securing his family's future. His life is filled with luxury, from the designer suits to the exclusive gatherings with New York's elite. Yet, behind the polished exterior lies an undercurrent of discontent. It's not that he doesn't enjoy the perks of his status. He does. But there's a deeper desire, a yearning that even his closest associates don't quite understand. He's spent his entire life fulfilling the expectations placed upon him. Alexander was groomed to continue the Pierce legacy, to expand it, to ensure it thrives long after he's gone. He married young to a woman his parents approved of. But the relationship crumbled under the weight of their mutual lack of affection. Divorce followed swiftly, but Alexander's resolve to create a family of his own, to have children who would inherit the Pierce name and fortune, remained unshaken. One day, Alexander sits in his office, staring out at the city skyline, when he gets a call from his doctor. It's a routine appointment, a checkup after months of discreet fertility tests that he agreed to take without much thought. He picks up the phone, expecting good news, or at the very least, nothing significant. But the voice on the other end tells a different story. The doctor's tone is cautious, professional, but there's no way to soften the blow. Alexander is sterile. The tests confirmed it. There's no chance of him fathering a child, no possibility of producing an heir to continue the Pierce line. Alexander's mind goes blank. He doesn't respond at first. He simply grips the phone tighter, feeling the sweat build on his palms. He can hear the doctor speaking, but the words lose meaning, echoing in a fog of disbelief. This isn't part of the plan. It can't be. For a moment, the entire foundation of his life, his purpose, his goals, everything, feels like it's crumbling beneath him. He mutters a quick thank you, hangs up the phone, and stares blankly at his desk, unable to process the magnitude of what he's just been told. In a daze, Alexander leaves his office. He tells his assistant he needs air, something he never does. He steps into the elevator, feeling suffocated, and when the doors open onto the street, he rushes out, ignoring the doorman's greeting. The noise of the city is a dull roar in his ears as he makes his way to his car, a sleek black sedan waiting for him. Without thinking, he climbs in and starts driving. He doesn't have a destination. He just needs to move, to get away from the office, from the life that suddenly feels like a trap. The rain begins to pour as he speeds down the highway, the city lights blurring through the water on his windshield. His grip on the steering wheel tightens as his frustration turns into rage. He thinks of his father, of his grandfather, of the expectations they set. He feels the weight of their legacy pressing down on him like an anchor, and now it's all slipping away, out of his control. He hits the gas harder, the engine roaring in protest. Suddenly, there's a screech of tires. The world turns into a chaotic blur as his car skids out of control. He sees the guardrail rush toward him in a split second, and then everything goes dark. When Alexander opens his eyes, the first thing he feels is pain. It courses through his body, a dull, throbbing ache that reminds him he's still alive. He blinks against the rain, struggling to make sense of his surroundings. His car is smashed, crumpled like a tin can against the barrier. The sound of rain pounding on the metal mixes with the distant sirens approaching. He hears a voice, faint at first, but growing clearer. "Stay with me," it says, and he realizes someone is crouched beside him. He turns his head, barely able to see through the haze of pain and confusion. It's a woman, her clothes soaked through from the rain, her hands shaking as she tries to pull him free. Despite the chaos, there's a calm determination in her eyes, a focus that cuts through his disorientation. The woman, Karen Morrison, digs her heels into the wet pavement, using all her strength to help Alexander out of the car. She feels the heat from the engine, sees the small flicker of flames licking at the edges of the hood. There's no time to wait for the paramedics. She shouts at him, telling him to move, to help her, but he's barely conscious. With a final grunt, she yanks him out, dragging him away just as the car erupts into a small burst of flames. They collapse onto the wet ground, rain pouring over them. Alexander coughs, his breath ragged, but he's alive. Karen checks him over, making sure he's breathing, that he's stable enough to wait for help. She doesn't know who he is, doesn't care about the expensive watch on his wrist or the custom suit he's wearing. He's just a person who needed saving. The paramedics arrive moments later, taking Alexander away. He watches through a fog of pain as they load him onto the stretcher, and just before he loses consciousness again, he catches a glimpse of Karen's face. It's the last thing he sees before everything goes black. Days pass before Alexander is well enough to be discharged. He's back in his penthouse, staring out the window, haunted by the memory of the crash and the woman who saved his life. He can't stop thinking about her, about the selflessness she showed. He knows nothing about her, but he feels an urge to find her, to thank her properly. He begins making calls, using his resources to track her down. Karen Morrison is back at work, standing in front of a classroom of young children in the Bronx. She's explaining a math problem, her voice calm and patient, but her mind drifts back to the accident. She wonders if the man she saved is all right. She doesn't even know his name. Her life is a stark contrast to Alexander's. She's dedicated her career to teaching, to making a difference in a community that often feels overlooked. She lives modestly in a small apartment that she's filled with books and photographs of her family. Karen's parents raised her with a strong sense of dignity and integrity, values she carries with her every day. She's worked hard for everything she has, and while her life is far from easy, it's filled with moments of genuine connection and joy. It's a normal day when Alexander finally finds her. He waits outside the community center, where she volunteers in the afternoons, unsure of what to expect. When Karen steps out, she's surprised to see him. He introduces himself awkwardly, stumbling over his words as he thanks her for what she did. He's sincere, but she brushes it off, saying anyone would have done the same. He knows that's not true. Their initial conversation is brief, but it leaves a lasting impression on both of them. For Alexander, it's the first time in a long time that he feels genuine gratitude, unconnected to wealth or status. For Karen, it's a reminder of the unexpected ways life can intersect, how one small decision can ripple outward in ways she never imagined. They part ways, but neither can shake the encounter. It's the beginning of something neither of them can fully comprehend yet. A bond that will challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about love, and about what truly matters in life. The days after the accident become a whirlwind of confusion and clarity for both Alexander and Karen. Alexander, back in his luxurious penthouse, can't stop thinking about the woman who saved him. He's never met anyone like her. Someone so selfless, so willing to risk everything for a stranger. He finds himself constantly replaying that moment. The rain pounding down, her determined face as she pulled him from the wreckage, her steady voice calming him despite the chaos. He's haunted by the memory and feels a nagging urge to know more about her. It's more than just gratitude now. It's a deep, almost inexplicable connection. He decides to seek her out again, ignoring the judgmental looks from his assistant when he asks for help finding her. He tracks down Karen at the community center where she volunteers after her teaching job, surrounded by kids from the neighborhood. Alexander watches from a distance, standing in the shadows, hesitant to interrupt. He sees her laughing with the children, her face lighting up with a joy that's rare in his own world of business deals and polished facades. He realizes he's never seen someone look so genuinely happy. It's a happiness that has nothing to do with money or status, but everything to do with the simple pleasure of connection and giving back. When he finally approaches, Karen is surprised to see him again. She didn't expect to ever cross paths with him after that night. Alexander, clearly out of his element, stumbles over his words as he thanks her once more. He's awkward, almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to the confident, commanding presence she remembers from their brief interactions. She brushes off his thanks, insisting that anyone would have done the same. But he knows that's not true. He's surrounded by people every day who wouldn't lift a finger if it didn't benefit them. Her humility catches him off guard. They end up sitting on a bench outside the center, talking as the sun dips behind the city skyline. Alexander is surprised at how easily the conversation flows. Karen talks about her students, the challenges they face, and her passion for education. He listens, really listens, for what feels like the first time in years. He finds himself sharing pieces of his own life that he's kept hidden even from his closest confidants, the pressure of his family legacy, the recent discovery of his sterility, and the crushing sense of failure it brought. Karen listens quietly, her expression softening as she realizes the depth of his pain. It's a side of him she never expected to see. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepens. Alexander starts showing up at the community center more often, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a curious visitor who genuinely wants to spend time with Karen. They fall into a comfortable rhythm, sharing stories, exchanging laughter, and discovering that they have more in common than they ever imagined. Alexander begins to see the world through Karen's eyes, her struggles, her triumphs, her commitment to the kids she teaches. It's a stark contrast to the privileged bubble he's lived in, and it leaves him feeling both humbled and inspired. One day, as they're walking through the park after one of her volunteer shifts, Karen hesitates, then decides it's time to tell him something important. She takes a deep breath and admits that she's pregnant. She watches Alexander's face carefully, searching for any sign of judgment or pity, but he's simply stunned. He had no idea. He asks her who the father is, but Karen shakes her head, brushing the question aside. It was a one-night encounter, a mistake, she says, something she never planned on. Alexander can tell she's embarrassed, but there's also a quiet strength in her voice, an acceptance of the situation. For Alexander, the news hits like a tidal wave. He's still grappling with the reality of his own sterility, and now, here is Karen, this incredible woman he's grown so close to, carrying twins. He feels a rush of conflicting emotions, joy for her, sorrow for what he can never have, and a deep, unspoken envy. Yet, more than anything, he feels a profound sense of connection, as if fate has somehow woven their lives together in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Despite the awkwardness of the moment, their bond only grows stronger. Alexander starts accompanying Karen to her doctor's appointments, insisting on being there to support her. At first, she's reluctant. She's not used to relying on anyone but herself. But she can see how much it means to him, how he lights up when the doctor points out the tiny, flickering heartbeats on the ultrasound. He's like a man seeing the world for the first time, every small detail a revelation. As they navigate this new dynamic, they face a barrage of obstacles from the outside world. Alexander's family, particularly his sister Charlotte, quickly catches wind of his growing involvement with Karen. Charlotte, a woman who has spent her entire life ensuring the Pierce family maintains its spotless reputation, is livid. She confronts Alexander in his office, her voice sharp and dripping with disdain. She accuses Karen of being a gold digger, someone who's using her pregnancy to manipulate him. Alexander defends Karen fiercely, something he never imagined himself doing. He realizes, in that moment, just how much he cares for her, how deeply he's come to respect and love the woman who saved his life. But it's not just his family. The media catches on too. Rumors swirl about the billionaire and the unknown woman from the Bronx. Paparazzi begin following Karen, snapping photos of her as she walks to work, bombarding her with invasive questions about the twins. It's overwhelming, a stark contrast to the quiet, private life she's led. She starts receiving hateful messages online, filled with racist and classist vitriol. It's a harsh reminder of the world they live in, a world that isn't ready to accept their relationship. Karen tries to distance herself from Alexander, thinking it's the only way to protect both herself and the twins. She's afraid of what this scrutiny will do to her life, to her career, to the children she's about to bring into the world. But Alexander won't let her push him away. He shows up at her apartment one rainy evening, soaked to the bone, refusing to leave until she talks to him. They argue, voices raised, both of them letting out the pent-up frustration and fear they've been carrying. He tells her he doesn't care about the media, about his family's disapproval, about anything but her and the twins. For the first time, she sees tears in his eyes, raw and unfiltered. In that moment, Karen realizes how much Alexander has changed. He's no longer the cold, distant businessman she met in the hospital. He's become someone who is willing to sacrifice everything for her, for a chance at a family he thought he could never have. She softens, letting him in, both figuratively and literally, as they embrace in the hallway. The rain pounding against the windows, a fitting backdrop to the emotional storm between them. Their newfound closeness is put to the test when Karen unexpectedly goes into labor weeks earlier than expected. It's a terrifying experience. Her contractions start in the middle of the night, sharp and sudden. She's alone at first, but she manages to call Alexander, her voice shaking as she tells him what's happening. He rushes over, breaking every traffic law as he speeds through the empty city streets. By the time they reach the hospital, it's chaos. Doctors and nurses swarm around Karen, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. The twins are coming early, too early, and there are complications. Alexander feels helpless, watching as they wheel Karen away, her face contorted with pain. He paces the waiting room, running his hands through his hair, whispering prayers he never thought he'd say. It's hours before anyone comes out to speak to him. When the doctor finally emerges, Alexander's heart feels like it might explode. The twins, Lily and Rose, have been born, but they're tiny, fragile, their lungs not fully developed. They've been rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit. The news is a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that they're alive, but fear for what might come next. He's allowed to see them, and when he does, he's overcome by a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brings him to his knees. The sight of those tiny, delicate figures in the incubators, fighting for every breath, is almost more than he can bear. Karen, still groggy from the delivery, reaches out for his hand when he comes to her side. He takes it, squeezing it tight, his own tears mingling with hers. They sit there together, staring through the glass at their daughters, bound by a love and a loss and a hope they never could have imagined when they first met. It's the hardest moment of their lives, but also the most beautiful, as they realize they've found something worth fighting for, each other and the fragile, precious lives they've brought into the world. In the weeks following the birth, the hospital becomes a second home for Alexander and Karen. Every day, they enter the neonatal intensive care unit together, their steps synchronized, an unspoken understanding forming between them. The sterile smell of the hospital, the beeping machines, and the hushed voices of nurses become their reality as they watch over the twins, Lily and Rose, who lie in tiny incubators surrounded by a web of tubes and wires. The girls are so small, their skin almost translucent, and every breath they take feels like a tiny, fragile miracle. Alexander has never felt so helpless. He's a man used to solving problems, to taking control, but here, he's at the mercy of forces beyond his influence. He sits beside the incubators, his hand pressed against the glass, whispering soft reassurances to his daughters, promising them a future full of love and protection. It's a stark contrast to the man he was before, the businessman who measured success in stock prices and corporate takeovers. Now, his world has narrowed down to the rise and fall of tiny chests, the flicker of eyelids, the first tentative grip of a tiny hand around his finger. Karen, too, is a constant presence at the hospital, her exhaustion barely hidden behind a mask of determination. She's a woman of immense strength, but even she feels the cracks forming. There are moments when she has to step out of the room, leaning against the wall, taking deep breaths to steady herself as tears spill down her cheeks. Alexander follows her every time, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight as she trembles against him. They've become each other's lifeline, their shared grief and fear binding them closer than ever before. The days are long and filled with uncertainty. Every time a doctor approaches, they hold their breath, fearing bad news. But slowly, the twins begin to gain strength. Lily opens her eyes first, startling them both with a pair of deep blue eyes that seem far too wise for a newborn. Rose follows soon after, her tiny hand reaching up as if searching for her sister. The progress is small, incremental, but it's enough to give them hope. The doctors tell them it will still be weeks before the twins are strong enough to go home. But for the first time, Alexander and Karen allow themselves to imagine a future beyond the hospital walls. Outside the sanctuary of the hospital, the world continues to turn. News of Alexander's relationship with Karen has spread, becoming fodder for gossip columns and business news alike. The media paints a sensational picture: a billionaire heir entangled with a struggling teacher from the Bronx. The twins cast as the unexpected heirs to the Pierce fortune. Paparazzi camp outside the hospital, their cameras flashing like lightning every time Alexander or Karen steps out. It's invasive and infuriating, but they do their best to ignore it, focusing on what truly matters. Alexander's family, however, is not so easily dismissed. Charlotte Pierce, his sister, demands a meeting. She arrives at the hospital unannounced one afternoon, her sharp heels clicking against the tile floor, her expression a mask of thinly veiled contempt. Karen watches from a distance as Charlotte confronts Alexander in the hallway, her voice low but laced with venom. Karen can't hear the words, but she doesn't need to. She sees the way Charlotte gestures toward the NICU, the way her eyes narrow when she glances in Karen's direction. It's clear she thinks Karen is an interloper, someone who has ensnared her brother for her own gain. Alexander defends Karen fiercely, his voice rising enough that a few nurses glance over. He tells Charlotte that the twins are his family now, that he doesn't care what anyone thinks. It's the first time he's ever stood up to her like this, and it feels like shedding a heavy weight he didn't realize he was carrying. Charlotte leaves in a huff, her parting words a bitter warning that he's throwing away his legacy for a fleeting infatuation. But as she walks away, Alexander turns back to the NICU, watching Karen through the glass as she gently strokes Lily's tiny hand. He knows he's made the right choice. The day finally comes when the doctors tell them the twins are strong enough to leave. It's a joyful moment, filled with laughter and tears, as they dress the girls in the tiny clothes Karen had bought weeks earlier, now slightly loose on their small frames. The nurses gather around, saying their goodbyes, giving Karen and Alexander quiet words of encouragement. They wheel the twins out together, blinking against the sunlight as they step into the world as a family for the first time. At home, everything changes. The penthouse, once a pristine symbol of Alexander's bachelor life, is quickly transformed into a chaotic, noisy space filled with the sounds of babies crying, bottles clinking, and soft lullabies playing in the background. Alexander, who once only cared about board meetings and stock prices, now finds himself pacing the floors at 3 a.m., rocking Lily in his arms as she wails inconsolably. He's a natural father, to his own surprise. He changes diapers without complaint, holds Rose close when she fusses, and whispers nonsense words just to see her smile. Karen, too, is thriving, despite the exhaustion. She's back in her element, finding joy in the small moments, feeding the twins, watching them sleep, and sharing quiet cups of coffee with Alexander in the early morning light, before the rest of the city wakes up. They've created a new kind of rhythm, a dance of partnership and love that neither of them expected, but both of them cherish deeply. Alexander decides to take a temporary leave of absence from his company. It's a shocking move, something that sends ripples through the business world. His advisors and board members are stunned, unable to comprehend why a man so driven would step away at the height of his career. But Alexander is resolute. For the first time, he feels like he's exactly where he needs to be, here, with Karen and the twins, building something real and lasting. He starts making changes, big ones. He sets up a scholarship fund in Karen's name, designed to help kids from underserved communities get access to quality education. It's a gesture that brings tears to Karen's eyes when he tells her, a sign of how deeply he's come to understand her values and her dreams. It's not about wealth or status anymore. It's about creating a legacy that means something, a legacy that's built on love and compassion rather than money. As the twins' first birthday approaches, they decide to host a celebration, a small but meaningful gathering that brings together the people who have become their support system over the past year. It's a mix of worlds, Alexander's wealthy associates mingling with Karen's friends and family from the Bronx. The differences are obvious, but so is the love that fills the room. Lily and Rose are the center of attention, dressed in matching pastel outfits, giggling as they're passed from one pair of adoring arms to another. In the middle of the party, as everyone gathers to sing happy birthday, Alexander steps forward. He's holding a small velvet box in his hand, his expression more serious than Karen has ever seen it. The room quiets, sensing that something important is about to happen. He takes Karen's hand, looking into her eyes with a depth of emotion that makes her heart race. He drops to one knee, his voice thick with emotion as he tells her how much he loves her, how she's changed his life in ways he never thought possible. He talks about the accident, about the moment she saved him, and how in many ways she's continued to save him every day since. He asks her to marry him, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine, deep desire to spend the rest of his life with her. Karen can't hold back her tears as she nods, whispering a yes through her sobs. The room erupts in applause, but for them, it feels like they're the only two people there, lost in their own world. He slips the ring onto her finger, a simple, elegant band that suits her perfectly, and pulls her into his arms as the twins clap their tiny hands in delight. In the months that follow, they settle into a life that feels almost like a dream. It's not perfect. There are sleepless nights, arguments, and moments of doubt. But it's real, and it's theirs. They find joy in the mundane, in the quiet moments spent together as a family. They watch Lily and Rose take their first steps, speak their first words, and grow into the lively, curious children they were always meant to be. The story closes on a peaceful scene in their home. The sun is setting, casting a warm glow through the windows. Alexander sits on the floor, playing with the twins, who are laughing and tumbling around him. Karen watches from the kitchen, a soft smile on her face. She feels a sense of contentment she's never known before, a deep, abiding happiness that fills every corner of her heart. Alexander looks up, meeting her eyes, and in that moment, they both know they've found their true family. It's not the one Alexander imagined when he was younger, tied to bloodlines and legacy, but it's far better than anything he could have dreamed. It's a family built on love, on choice, on the belief that the bonds we create are far stronger than those we're born into. They've created something new, something lasting, a legacy not of wealth but of love. And that, they realize, is the greatest gift they could ever give their daughters.